Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Love for the Dhamma. October 7, 2003. Back when Ajahn Mun was alive, scholarly monks would say of meditating monks, "What can they know? They sit with their eyes closed. What can they see?" They're still asking that question today. What can meditators see with their eyes closed? Of course, the answer is that they see their own minds. Scholarly monks would say, "Here we spend years looking through the books, and we still don't fully understand them. How can you understand them by sitting there with your eyes closed?" The answer is that the real problems in life don't lie in books. Books contain only the names of the problems. The real problems lie in the mind. Which is why we sit here focusing the mind on the breath as a way of bringing the mind into the present moment, where we can watch it. We turn our gaze inward, instead of outward. What do you see when you look outward? You see aging, illness, and death. You see other people's issues. Their good points, their bad points. You see the world around you. Its good points, its bad points. But those aren't the things that make a real difference in your life. The things that make a real difference are your decisions, the way you manage your own mind. This is why contentment is such an important principle in the practice. Contentment in terms of where you are, the situation in which you find yourself, contentment in terms of your various physical comforts and discomforts. However, in terms of the people around you, you need to find a group of admirable friends. Even if you find just one admirable friend, you've got a lot right there. That's important. Don't practice contentment with your friends. If they're not people who live by the Dhamma or who speak the Dhamma, if they're people who engage in lying and stealing and divisive speech, abusive speech, and idle chatter, then you don't want to hang around with them. As the Buddha said, if those are the only people you can find, it's better to go alone. But once you've found a good admirable friend, a good community in which to practice, you should be willing to put up with a lot of hardships. Think again of the time of Ajahn Mun. He was way out in the forest. People who wanted to study with him had to go walking on foot, many times not even sure they were going to find him, because he was frequently on the move. When someone showed up to practice with him, he was sure that that person really wanted to practice with him because that person had already put up with a lot of hardships, not only in finding him, but also in staying with him. Ajahn Fuang once expressed a similar idea. Back in the very earliest days of Wat Amasathit, it was very difficult to get there. The trip from Bangkok to Rayong took almost a full day, and it wasn't an easy ride. From the highway you had to go further on, 6 kilometers along a dirt road, muddy and potholed. He said that by the time people came out to see him, having gone through all that, he was convinced that they were really serious about listening to what he had to teach, so he'd be happy to teach them. He said that it was a lot better than the days when he lived at Wat Asakaram, on the outskirts of Bangkok. Anybody with time to kill could come out and try to kill his time, too. Who knew how serious they were, because it was so easy to get there. A willingness to put up with hardships is an important part of the practice, but it's not just a matter of gritting your teeth and bearing with them. The hardships are essential in helping you gain understanding. When things aren't going well outside, where are you going to focus your attention? Well, you could focus outside and just get upset about things outside, but that doesn't accomplish anything. If you're wise, you learn from the hardships the lesson that you've got to focus your attention more and more inwardly. If you're going to find happiness, you've got to find it inside. This is why the great Ajahns were able to find the Dhamma out in the forest. They had to We tend to have a romantic idea of the forest, peaceful, green, beautiful forest, because our idea of forest life has become awfully sanitized. Actually, there are a lot of difficulties there. There are dangerous animals, not just the tigers that seem romantic and exciting, but also the day-to-day things. The bugs and snakes and other animals that carry diseases. When you're surrounded by things like that, where will you turn? Our natural tendency is to want to look for happiness in terms of sounds, sights, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations, but when these things aren't all that pleasant, where do you turn? When you get sick and there's no doctor or medicine around, where do you turn? You have to turn within. Being able to keep the mind centered becomes a life and death matter. If you can find that sense of well-being within, if you can stir up those resources of goodwill and discernment that you're going to need in order to live in the forest, in spite of the fact that things seem to be weighing in on you from all directions, that's where you really learn the strength of the Dhamma. The importance of the Dhamma as a refuge. This forces you to choose your priorities. What's really important in your life? Physical comfort or the comfort of the Dhamma? Pleasant people who do things the way you like, or people who teach you the Dhamma, people who exemplify the Dhamma? A happiness that's based on things outside, or a happiness that comes from within? Difficulties on the outside really force these issues in a way that pleasant surroundings don't. Your realization of this, and your willingness to act on that realization. That's what really makes a Dhamma practitioner out of you when you finally decide that you're not going to hold anything back, that this really is what's most important in life. And you're going to go at it without reservations. The Buddha gives the image of an elephant going into battle. The elephant fights with his front feet, fights with his back feet, fights with his front quarters and back quarters, but he protects his trunk all the time. He isn't willing to use his trunk because his trunk is his most sensitive part. The elephant trainer sees that and realizes that this elephant hasn't really given himself to the king. It's the same when you balk at discomfort. It's a sign you really haven't given yourself to the practice. The willingness to put up with discomforts, to thrive on them. That's the mark of a true practitioner, someone who really has what they call Dhamma Chanda, desire for the Dhamma, and Dhamma Rati, love for the Dhamma. This is what makes all the difference in your practice. If you hold back from the practice, it's going to hold things back in terms of the results you're going to receive. We miss out on these results because our minds keep flowing out. The Buddha talks about asavas, which can be translated as effluents, both in the sense that they flow out, and in the sense that they're not especially clean. The force of these currents that come flowing out of the mind can drive us all over the place. Sensual desire, views, ignorance. These currents come flowing out of the mind, and we tend to ride with them. You don't really realize how strong they are because you don't try to withstand them. As a result, they can push you all over the place. Only when you decide to turn around and look at them as the main issue will you be able to work free from them. The problem is that they keep pointing outward and saying, "Look. See that over there, and that thing over there is something you want or something you hate." They keep deflecting attention away from themselves. They're like politicians. Politicians do their dirty work and then they say, "See that person over there? He's doing something horrible." They get you all excited about the other person so you don't notice what they're doing. This is the way the mind operates. These asavas keep flowing out, pushing you in all kinds of directions. To withstand them, as the Buddha says, you have to create an island where that flood doesn't overwhelm you. Even if you can't yet find the ultimate island of the transcendent, you build a temporary island with mindfulness and concentration, so that you're not pushed around all the time. That means taking a stance where you are. Sometimes, taking a stance where you are requires making some sacrifices. But that's where you make your choice. Whether you want to make that sacrifice or just continue going with the flow. Going with the flow seems easy because it's more habitual, but actually there's an awful lot of suffering in going with the effluent flow. You never know where it's going to push you. Like a flooding river, it sometimes hits you with logs and debris, or throws you up against a stone wall. But as you take your stance on your island of right here, right now, even though it may seem more difficult, you begin to get used to it, and you realize that you wouldn't want to live any other way. You begin to appreciate the force of the effluents. You begin to see how they push you around, and you see the suffering that comes as a result. That's when you realize that you made the right choice not to continue with your old ways, slushing around in the world, but actually taking a stance and keeping it solid. So, it requires powers of resistance. We usually use our powers of resistance to resist things, people, situations, outside. What we've got to do is learn to resist the push that comes from within, the push that makes us want to focus on things outside, that distracts our attention from the real issues bubbling up in the mind. That's the other translation for asava, fermentation. These things come bubbling up, and who knows where they're going to take you if you give in to them? As you begin to take your stance, you come to see the value of not following through with those fermentations, and you see the value of contentment. You see that once you make your choice, you're going to maintain your stance here as a person who loves the Dhamma more than you love comfort or whatever the defilements are clamoring for. That's when the Dhamma really shows what an excellent thing it is, what a worthwhile thing it is, why it's the sort of thing you can give your whole life to. Ultimately, the teaching asks nothing less than that you give yourself totally to the practice. But what it gives in return is more than life, far more than worth the effort you give it. The Buddha once said that if you could make a deal that someone would spear you with 100 spears 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, for 100 years, with the guarantee that at the end of the 100 years you would gain awakening, that would be a deal worth taking. Otherwise, think of all the eons of endless sufferings involved in repeatedly coming back again and again. He said that when you attained awakening as a result of that deal, you wouldn't even think that you had attained it with pain and suffering. It would have come with joy. So, when you run into hardships in your daily life, compare them to the 300 spears a day. Put things into perspective. That'll help keep you on course. Universal Truths. June 13, 2007. When you meditate during the Dhamma talk, 99% of your attention should be with your breath. Let the talk be in the background because the Dhamma is found inside the mind. The Dhamma in words is just pointers. As you listen to the talk, remind yourself that the words are pointing inside your mind. If you're inside your mind paying attention to what you're doing, you're already at the right place. You don't need the talk. If you find yourself wandering outside, you'll run up against the talk and it'll point you back in to where the real problem is. Ignorance. Real ignorance is not ignorance of words or principles. It's ignorance of what's going on in the mind. In particular, it's ignorance of how you're causing yourself suffering. In a broader sense, it's ignorance of 4 noble truths. Ignorance of where there's suffering right now and of what you're doing to cause the suffering. Ignorance of what you could be doing to put an end to the suffering, and of what the end of suffering would be like. Those are the 4 things you could be paying attention to. They're things that are happening right inside. They're not happening in the words. The words simply point to these things, and especially to your experience of suffering, something that nobody else is experiencing. That suffering is as close as you get to really purely personal experience. There's no way you can take it out and show it to us. Scientists studying your brain can see all sorts of indicators that you might be in pain, but they can't actually see your suffering. And there's no way you can compare your suffering to anyone else's to see who's suffering more, exactly what it tastes like, or what it feels like. But it is something you can know for yourself. So you should pay attention to it. What this means is that the 4 noble truths are not some abstract teaching whose truth is peculiar to India 2,600 years ago. They're things happening right here, right now, and they're happening very directly in your awareness. To chip away at that ignorance, you start by focusing on something more obviously happening right here, right now. The breath. In the Buddha's analysis of suffering, ignorance conditions fabrication. Bodily fabrication is the breath. If you breathe with ignorance, it can be a condition for suffering. If you breathe with knowledge and awareness, It can help cut through suffering. It can help you see your ignorance more clearly. As you see your ignorance more clearly, you're replacing it with knowledge. So when you're focused on the breath, learning to breathe comfortably, allowing the mind to relate in a comfortable way with the breath, you're taking a stand against ignorance and all the ignorant thought processes that go on through the day. You're putting up a resistance to them so that you can understand them. It's through understanding them that you can go beyond them, transcend them. These principles are universal. That's why the Buddha called them Ariya Sakka, which we translate as noble truths. But the word Ariya, in addition to meaning noble, also means standard, in the sense of a universal standard. So these truths are not only noble, they're also universal standards. They apply to all of us, with no exceptions. They're something we all have in common. We each experience suffering and the cause of suffering for ourselves alone, but the pattern of our suffering is something we have in common, which is why the path to the end of suffering is universal. It doesn't matter what country you come from, what your background, what your language. The path works across the board if you apply it in all fairness, if you realize that this is something that applies to you as much as it does to anyone else. Most of us like to think of ourselves as exceptions to the rule. We like to think that it's going to be different for us somehow, especially when you hear of all the effort that the various ajahns put into the practice. We'd rather not have to do all that work. We think that maybe things should be easier for us because we're better educated, or maybe we know more in our culture. Well, no, we don't. Our problems are just the same as theirs. They may be dressed up a little bit differently in each case, but at their root they're all the same. Ajahn Fuang once quoted Ajahn Mun saying that people are all alike, but then if you look a little deeper you see that they're really not, but then when you look deeper still, you see that they really are. Ajahn Fuang's comment on that was, "Take that and think about it for a while." There are some differences, but what we have in common is what's really important. Like the chant we had just now. Aging, illness, death, and separation. These are things we all have in common. The chant is a little bit lacking in that it simply reminds you that you are subject to aging, subject to illness, subject to death. Or as in the Thai translation, these things are normal for you. You're subject to being separated from things that you love. Life starts out, you're always learning new things, gaining new things, but then it reaches a point where they all start going away. What you do have left is your actions. You will fall heir to what you do, say, and think. And the results depend on whether what you do, say, and think is skillful or not. As the Buddha said, thinking about these truths as they apply to yourself keeps you from doing unskillful things. You realize, my gosh, if I allow myself to think a lot of unskillful stuff today, the results are going to seep out into my words, they're going to seep out into my actions. Then I'll start not just thinking unskillful things, but also doing and saying unskillful things. That all begins to pile up. Do you want that? No. So these reflections are meant to keep you in line, to keep you from doing harmful things to yourself, harmful things to other people. They teach you restraint. But the original sutta in which this chant is found doesn't stop just there. It goes on to recommend that you remind yourself that these things don't just apply to you, they apply to everybody, to all levels of being. No matter where you go this lifetime, the next lifetime, whatever the realm, all beings that have been, all beings that will be, whether they're living, whether they're dying, whether they're being reborn. These principles apply to all of them. And, as the Buddha said, when you think about that, it not only prevents you from doing unskillful things, but it gets you on the path. You finally realize that there's no other escape from these principles of suffering and its cause. And the path has to be the same for everybody, so that the cessation would be the same for everybody. You are not an exception. No matter where you go, whether you would like to be reborn as a Brahma, or to come back as a human being, who's maybe a little bit more wealthy, maybe a lot more wealthy, better looking, more powerful, you would still be subject to these same truths, no matter what. That's meant to give rise not just to restraint, but also to a sense of samvega, something that goes deeper. A realization that the way you've been living your life really is going nowhere. The way most people live their lives goes nowhere. The only somewhere you can go is out. Even that's not a place, but still it's a direction. Otherwise life has no direction at all. It just wanders around, looking at this for a while, looking at that for a while, like the map charting. The way a dog wanders around the neighborhood, sniffing at this, sniffing at that, wandering over here, rolling in this, rolling in that. It really goes nowhere in particular at all. But if you accept that these truths are universal, then the Buddha's ready to show you the universal way out. He doesn't teach just good or bad karma, or skillful or unskillful karma. He says that there are gradations of skillful karma. In particular, there's the plain old skillful karma that keeps you in the cycle, and then there's the karma that puts an end to karma, that gets you out of the cycle. That's the path that cuts through the ignorance, the path that cuts through the craving that causes suffering. That's the way out. So it's up to us to decide whether we still want to dabble around, to roll around in a few dead squirrels, or whether we've had enough and want out. If we want out, then the path is all laid out, from right view on through right concentration, which means that you try to endow your concentration with all the factors of the path. Virtue, concentration, discernment. All these things should come together in your practice. So as you focus on the breath, try to do it in a virtuous way. In other words, do it with restraint. Remind yourself, you can't go wandering off, dabbling in this, dabbling in that. You've really got to be true to the theme of your concentration. And your concentration should be discerning. Which ways of focusing on the breath make the mind uncomfortable? Which make the breath uncomfortable? Which ways of focusing, which ways of thinking about the breath, which ways of labeling and understanding the breath help make it more comfortable, easier to stay here, so that it does become your home? So that no matter where you go, you have this home inside, this nourishment on the path. That's how your discernment works. You want to bring all of these qualities together. If you leave any of them out, then the path is incomplete. When it's not complete, it can't do its work. So you give it all of your mind. The word for mind in Pali Siddha also means the quality of really being intent on what you are doing. And Siddha in this second sense is one of the elements of right effort, one of the bases for success. So give this practice your whole mind, your whole heart, your full intent, so that the results will be full and complete as well. Stupid about pleasure. September 27, 2007. When it comes to the issue of pleasure, we prefer both and. We don't like either or. The more ways we can find pleasure, the more types of pleasure we can find, the better. After all, that's a lot of what pleasure is about. The variety. We don't like the idea of having to be stuck with one particular type of pleasure, or of having to abandon some of the things we already like for the sake of something else we also like. We want to have it all. As the Buddha once said, even if it rained gold coins, we wouldn't have enough to satisfy people's desire for sensual pleasures. We always want more and more. That's why we tend to be pretty stupid about the issue of pleasure. Psychologists have shown that even when people know the drawbacks of a certain activity they like, they still go back to it again and again and again. Even when they know they have better things to do, more lasting, more solid forms of pleasure they can work toward, there are still some fleeting pleasures they can't let go of. So it's not the case that when you find a better pleasure, your attachments to your old lesser pleasures simply fall away like leaves off a tree. The tendency in the mind is to keep trying to gather more and more, adding new pleasures to the stock of old pleasures we want to keep in store. You can see this even among some of the least advanced of the noble ones, the stream enterers. The Buddha had to counsel them to be heedful. That was his last instruction. Of all the monks gathered at the Buddha's passing away, the least advanced were stream enterers. And yet the Buddha had to counsel them to be heedful. There are other places in the canon where he explicitly states that even a stream enterer can be heedless. After all, when you've reached that level, you Know for sure that there's a deathless, that you're destined for nibbana. You'll have at most only 7 more lifetimes, and they're all going to be human lifetimes at the very least. And a sense of security can develop around that thought. Because of that sense of security, it's possible for a stream enterer to become complacent, to say nothing of people who have simply experienced jhana, or right concentration. Just the fact that you've encountered the really refined pleasures of right concentration doesn't mean that you automatically let go of your attachments to other forms of pleasure. The principle of both and applies here as well. People want to enjoy their concentration along with all the other pleasures they've managed to gather up in the course of their lives. This is why we also need discernment to remind us that there are a lot of important areas where things are either or. In particular, discernment is needed to see the drawbacks of many of the old pleasures we've been wallowing in. This is a lesson we resist. 1. We don't like to be told that we've been engaging in harmful or unskillful behavior. And 2. The mind has an incredible tendency to put up walls to screen out the negative sides of our pleasures. Because we like our pleasures so much, we resist acknowledging their drawbacks. I was talking recently to a monk who had been to the police morgue in Bangkok, where they allow monks to come and observe autopsies. He saw the doctors working in the morgue very efficiently, going through bodies, opening them up, with all the guts and stuff spilling out. And he wondered, how do they still manage to go home and sleep with their wives and enjoy their old sensual pleasures? Then he walked into their office and saw girly calendars all over the walls. That's when he understood. They were determined to maintain the perception of the beauty of the body, in spite of what they were seeing every day. The side of the human mind that wants to maintain its old attachments. It doesn't give them up easily. It does everything it can to hold on. You give things up only when you really see that there's a direct connection between suffering and the pleasures you've been enjoying, and that there's a better alternative. Only then will the mind begin to let go. This is the duty of discernment. To see the drawbacks of these things. This is why right concentration on its own, or jhana on its own, is not enough to cut through your other attachments. Simply because you can sit here and be very blissful, very equanimous, doesn't mean that you're going to see the connections between unskillful pleasures and their negative consequences. That insight requires an act of determination. You really have to be heedful to remind yourself that these issues are either or. You have to work at developing the strength and determination of discernment that can see this clearly. Ajahn Chah, in one of his talks, refers to the knowledge of the 3 characteristics not as a truth, not as a form of discernment, but as a strength. That's what it is. A strength. It gives you a solid place where you can stand outside your attachments and really look at them. For the most part, we just jump into our attachments, jump into our pleasures, and totally lose perspective. When they slosh around, we get sloshed around as well. But being able to step back from these things gives us a solid place to stand. And that solid place to stand is a strength in the mind. It helps us to resist the temptation to go jumping back in. So this is a theme you have to contemplate over and over again. The theme of either or, together with the theme of the connections between the pleasures you enjoy and the drawbacks they carry in their wake. This is why the path has right view right at the very beginning, and why the Buddha said that of all the various strengths in the mind, the strength of discernment is what holds the others together. The image he gives is of building a house. You're putting up the beams to form the roof, but only when the ridgepole is in place are the other beams secure. Up to that point they can still sway back and forth. They're still not quite solid. But when you finally get that ridgepole up across the top, everything fits together properly and stays solid. The ridgepole is discernment. Until discernment is strong, everything else, your conviction, your persistence, your mindfulness, your concentration, can sway back and forth. You may like your concentration, but you can also like whatever else life has to offer. You treat your life like a big flower garden or a vast buffet where you can choose all the things you want. That's your preferred attitude. You come to your senses only when you clearly see that things are either or. The more you let your mind go wandering around in sensual desires, the harder it is to get back. the harder it is to turn the concentration into something transcendent. Even when you've hit the transcendent for the first time, you're still not totally safe. There can still be the complacent thought that this is good enough. You've reached the point of being a noble one for sure, guaranteed against falling into the lower realms, guaranteed that nibbana will be attained within 7 lifetimes. So it's possible to be complacent even on that level. Your work on discernment still isn't complete. So while we practice, we need to develop this added strength, the strength of discernment. It helps us see connections between our pleasures and their consequences, and it also helps us to see where there's a disconnect, where you have to choose one form of pleasure over another. There's a passage in the Dhammapada. When you see a greater form of happiness that comes from abandoning a lesser form of happiness, the wise person abandons the lesser form for the sake of the greater. Note that not everybody does that. It's only the wise person who does. Someone who once translated this verse said that this couldn't possibly be the meaning of the verse because it's so obvious. Everyone knows enough to abandon the lesser pleasure in favor of the greater. But that's not really the case. Very few people do this. Very few people see that it's an either or. They want the both and. This is because we're so stupid around pleasure. Sometimes we intentionally make ourselves stupid. We don't want to see the connection between our pleasures and their drawbacks. We don't want to see the way one pleasure fights with another, is inconsistent with another. Even when it's right before our eyes, we refuse to see. So while it's important that we develop concentration, we also need to develop the discernment that makes it right concentration, that keeps it on track, that helps you to appreciate it for what it is. The pleasure of concentration is one of those rare pleasures that has no drawbacks. It may be shaky in the beginning. And that's probably one of the reasons why when we start out we don't want to place all our hopes on it, because we know how difficult it is to attain. But later on, when it becomes easier and more consistent, we can get complacent about that, too, thinking that we can tap into it whenever we want. So you have to develop the discernment, the strength in the mind that can help overcome both forms of complacency, both reasons for wanting everything to be both and. As long as you're still on the path, the either or has to be kept in mind. Only the wisdom of either or can get you beyond. The taste versus the reality. August 1, 2007. In India they have an interesting theory about why people enjoy art. It's based on a distinction between an actual emotion and the taste of the emotion. They say that people enjoy art. This includes drama, music, literature, all the fine arts, because in looking at the depiction of a particular emotion, they don't actually experience the emotion. They taste it. The taste is always pleasant even when the emotion being depicted is very unpleasant. Fear, anguish, or sorrow. If it's well portrayed, the audience likes the depiction because they like the taste. They taste, for example, the taste of grief, which is not grief itself, but compassion. The taste of fear is not fear, but excitement. So we enjoy art not because we're actually experiencing the emotion being depicted, but because we like the taste. This distinction is useful to keep in mind when you contemplate your thoughts, especially when you're sitting here meditating. Sometimes focusing on the breath starts to lose its appeal. You lose interest. Even when you get nice long periods of bliss and well-being, part of the mind gets bored. It wants some action, it wants to taste some emotions. So you start thinking about all kinds of other things. But you have to remember that no matter how attractive and tasty those alternatives, all the different worlds that you can create in your mind may seem, actually living in them would be pretty miserable. So don't get beguiled by the taste. We had an incident of this in my own family. A relative of mine was a novelist, and her novels were pretty melodramatic. She liked stories filled with scandalous surprises. Murder, incest, intrigue, infidelity. They made for very interesting stories. But when in her own life she encountered some marital infidelity, it was the end of her. The sorrow caused her death. So it's one thing to imagine these things, but it's another thing to live them. Always keep that in mind. Even the stories, the narratives we like to make about our own practice, about the progress we expect, about how we'll attain concentration, and from concentration we'll quickly move on to insight, and there it will be liberation. We like those stories because of the taste. We like to read the stories of the Ajahns because the stories are contrived in ways to make them very compelling. They're designed to make you want to practice. What you miss in the stories, though, are the long days where nothing happens at all, or the long fallow periods in the meditation. Meditations that may have been perfectly pleasant, but with no ups and downs, or meditations that were actually unpleasant because the mind was unwilling to settle down. Those are the parts not depicted in the books, but when you actually meditate, everyone's bound to experience those things. So you've got to keep a perspective on your thoughts, on the stories you like to tell, even about your own practice. We're here to train the mind, and part of training the mind involves doing things over and over and over again. Pulling the mind away from distraction over and over again, keeping the mind with its object over and over again, taking a skill that you develop while you're meditating and learning to apply it in daily life over and over again. That may not be exciting or compelling, and the mind will have a tendency to rebel sometimes, but you have to ask yourself when you're rebelling, where are you going? If you think of dream worlds or pleasant worlds where you could be right now, ask yourself, what would it actually be like to be there? There's a great story in Ajahn Lee's autobiography where he tires of being a monk and starts thinking about disrobing. So one night he decides to think seriously about disrobing. What's actually going to happen, what it's really going to be like. He starts out with a story that sounds pretty good. He gets a job and then a raise in pay. He's doing pretty well, so well that he decides he wants the daughter of a nobleman for his wife. That, in reality, would have been pretty unlikely. Ajahn Lee was the son of a peasant in the northeast. It's very unlikely that he would have gotten anywhere near the daughter of a nobleman. But he was able to contrive a story whereby he actually meets one, and she gets attracted to him, and they end up getting married. That's when reality sets in. The daughter of a nobleman is probably very delicately brought up, yet for the family to survive she would have to work. So she gets a job, and she has a child, but with the stresses of work and pregnancy, she dies soon after childbirth. He's left with the kid, and her parents want nothing to do with him. So he hires a woman to be the wet nurse. At first, she's good with the kid, and after a while she works herself into his affections. They eventually get married. But then she has her own child, and she starts playing favorites. That's when it gets really bad. He comes home from work at night and the mother has one version of the day's events, the first child has another version, and the second child has still another version of the story. They're all fighting. Ajahn Lee feels like he's being pulled in 3 different directions. He thinks to himself, boy, I wish I were back as a monk. Then he realizes, of course, I'm still a monk. That puts the issue of disrobing in a different light. In other words, he talked himself out of doing something foolish by allowing his dreams of disrobing to get real. So this is one way of dealing with the allure of distracting thoughts. Ask yourself, if I really lived in that situation, what would it be like? What would the constraints of that situation be? When you think of the different worlds you could be going to, the worlds of lay life, the worlds of being a monk in the forest in Thailand. While you're thinking of those worlds, they seem like open opportunities. But you have to realize that each of those worlds has its constraints, its constrictions. And the taste of the thought is very different from the actual emotion of being there. So if a particular thought is really beguiling, ask yourself what it would really be like to go to that particular state of being. You'd probably find yourself wishing you had some quiet time to be by yourself. But here you already have quiet time to be by yourself, so make the most of it. If thoughts of boredom come up, question those thoughts. This desire for playing around. There's a sutta in which the Buddhist says that this is why beings fall from the bliss of the higher realms. They start getting wanton and reckless. They see some of the lower realms. They say to themselves, what does that taste like? It's through their carelessness and wantonness, wanting to play around a little bit, wanting to sample new tastes, wanting a change of scenery that they fall, and then just keep on falling. The universe evolves not because of a divine plan, but because of recklessness and irresponsibility. So these irresponsible thoughts, watch out for them. Remind yourself that when suffering comes, it's real. After all, it's a noble truth, and it really is painful, it really does hurt. And as for the anguish of the mind that's stuck in a particular situation, you're outside of those situations right now, so don't let yourself slip back in. This is why the Buddha says we should reflect day after day after day on the reflections we chanted just now. We're subject to aging, subject to illness, subject to death, subject to separation. These things are real, and the suffering they entail is real. In the original sutta, the Buddha advises reflecting not only on that, but also on the fact that all living beings are subject to these things. No matter where we go in the Deva realms, the Brahma realms, whatever, we're all subject to death. That should give you a strong sense of samvega and a desire to be heedful. Samvega means a sense of dismay, a sense of urgency in trying to get out of being trapped in a situation. And heedful means watching over your actions very carefully, realizing that your actions do have ramifications. They've been making a big deal recently about the fact that psychologists are now studying happiness. Well, Buddhism has been studying happiness for 2,600 years. And it focuses on the most important thing that most psychologists tend to ignore, which is that the way you look for happiness is going to have strong ramifications. The actions you do, the things you do and say and think in order to attain happiness. If you're not careful, they can lead to some very unhappy results. They can turn around and devour you. No intention is free from ramifications. In other words, anything you do with a dishonest intention is likely to lead to an experience of suffering. Even though it may yield happiness in the short term, there are long-term ramifications. You can't get away from that fact. The way most people live nowadays is based on the premise that it doesn't matter what happens down along the road. That's in the future. I want happiness right now. I want it fast. So people like to be told that the only thing that matters is the present moment, where that's all there is. Just the present moment. But your intentions in the present moment act as a cause for things further down the line, on into the future. You want to make sure that those things coming in the future will be good to experience. This sometimes means doing things you don't like to do right now, but you realize that they'll lead to a long-term happiness. Or you may have to stop yourself from doing things you'd like to do right now, because they would lead to long-term pain, not just a tangy taste of pain, but the anguish of the actual thing. Your skill in talking yourself into doing what would lead to long-term happiness, and into avoiding things that would lead to long-term pain. That's one of the most important skills you can develop, not only in meditation, but in life as a whole. So remember the difference between the taste and the actual emotion. The taste of the emotion is always pleasant, which is why we enjoy art, why we enjoy works of the imagination, why we enjoy our dreams and fantasies. But the emotion itself often entails pain. So you do your best not to be heedless. Don't fall for the taste. Levels of addiction. November 11, 2006. What is attachment? It's basically a kind of addiction, trying to find happiness in things that have never given a true happiness, in things that aren't worth the effort. And we do it again and again and again. Partly, this is from a lack of imagination. We can't imagine other ways of finding happiness. Partly, it's from a lack of skill. We haven't mastered other ways, other approaches for finding happiness. And partly, it's simply a lack of knowledge. We're not paying careful attention to what's going on. So in the practice we try to develop more imagination, more skills, more knowledge. Let's start with the knowledge. When you find yourself addicted to a particular pleasure and yet you know it has its drawbacks, look to see when the felt need for that pleasure arises. What sort of dis-ease is there in the body, what sort of dis-ease is there in the mind, that incites you with a sudden urge to try to alleviate that sense of dis-ease in the same old way you've tried before? Exactly what are the triggers, what are the feelings? Watch them arise, watch them pass away. You'll begin to realize that the need you have, say, for a particular kind of food or particular kind of pleasure, a particular kind of object, a particular kind of relationship is not permanent. In other words, if you don't give in to that old impulse, the need is not going to stay there. It goes away. If it's a basic hunger, you may need to feed the body, but you don't necessarily have to feed it with something that's going to cause trouble later on. But so many of our other needs last for just a little while. If you have enough endurance to watch them from a different vantage point, you can watch them go away and you're done with them for the time being. A whispering voice in your mind might say that the impulse may be gone for now, but it's going to return, so why don't you just go ahead and give in now? But you don't have to be intimidated by that whispering voice. You can tell it, we'll deal with its return when it returns. Right now I want to get over this one hurdle. If you get good at watching the need arise and pass away, you develop a greater sense of detachment from it. The Buddha also says to look for the actual gratification you get out of trying to fill that need in the old way. After all, if there wasn't any gratification at all, you wouldn't go for it. And you won't understand it enough to really let go of it if you keep trying to deny that the gratification is there. At the same time, look for the drawbacks. Learn to compare the two. Is the gratification really worth the price? If you can't think of any other way of alleviating that need or desire, that's where you need to develop skill and imagination. A lot of the training is aimed at expanding your range of imagination. It's possible to find happiness in life without giving in to your old attachments. The more you see the drawbacks of the attachments, the more willing you'll be to listen to the Dhamma to expand your imagination of what's possible. The Buddha himself said that as he was practicing, the idea of having to give up his sensual pleasures didn't appeal to him. But then he allowed himself to imagine that a higher type of pleasure was possible. And he realized that to find that higher level of happiness, that more gratifying and more rewarding level of happiness, he'd have to give up his sensual pleasures. So, for the time being, that's what he did. He didn't totally undercut sensual passions at first, but for the time being he told himself to put them aside. That's how he was able to get the mind into states of concentration that provided an even deeper and more gratifying pleasure than sensual passion could provide. You'll notice this as you work with the breath. There come times when just the process of breathing can feel really gratifying. There's a very strong, intense feeling of pleasure that feels almost sensual. But as the Buddha says, it's not sensual. It has to do with the form of the body, as opposed to sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and outside tactile sensations. But it can feel really good in a very visceral way. That's important. Once you see that there's this possibility, it's easier to let go of your other desires as they arise. You've got something better. There's a passage where the Buddha says that the reason we get so stuck on sensual desires, sensual pleasures, is because we don't see any other alternative to pain. But when you see that there is the alternative and, as you reflect on it, you see that it has fewer drawbacks, greater rewards, and that you can learn how to tap into it when you need it, then it can be your new attachment, a much better one. If you want to call it an addiction, it's a healthy addiction, as opposed to the unhealthy ones you've pursued in the past. So in the beginning it's a matter of learning to imagine yourself accessing the pleasure of concentration, realizing that there is that possibility, and then developing the skill. That way, having developed the skill, your knowledge gets more precise. After a while you begin to see that the level of concentration you've obtained is not as gratifying as you might like. So you can ask yourself, are there deeper, more gratifying levels of concentration? Well, the Buddha says there are. Again, open your imagination to that idea and see what's there in your present state of concentration that's still a burden, still stressful, still unsatisfactory. Learn to let go of that. In many cases, this will involve abandoning some of the factors that got you into concentration to begin with, such as directed thought and evaluation, so there may be a resistance to letting them go. Other times there's not. You see clearly that you don't need these things, and you simply let them drop. Either way, the process of imagining that you can let them drop will open the way for you to go through more and more refined levels of concentration, deeper, more pervasive levels of pleasure and well-being, all the way to a strong state of equanimity. Even the equanimity that comes when you let go of pleasure has a very strong sense of well-being. You feel perfectly satisfied. You can stay there with the stillness, and it feels deep down good. In this way you find that there are alternative ways for finding happiness in life, finding pleasure in life. You look back at your old addictions, and they seem not to make much sense anymore. From your new perspective, you wonder why you would have felt so addicted to them in the first place. In this way the Buddha doesn't ask you just to go cold turkey, with no gratification, nothing to replace your old addiction. He gives you something new and viscerally pleasing to hold on to. In so doing, you expand your imagination to other levels as well. You begin to see your old ways of doing things as not so fixed or necessary as you once thought they were. You begin to loosen up your sense of who you are and where you find your happiness, and that alerts you to the fact that you can change even further. You feel more inclined to try out new things in the meditation, even though they seem to go beyond your old ideas of what you thought was possible. This is why the Buddha talks about nibbana primarily in metaphorical terms. To excite your imagination. He's not totally silent on the topic, and he's not contrary to what most people say, willing only to discuss it in negative terms. He has some very positive things to say about it, calling it shelter harbor. The beyond. This is to expand your imagination to encompass the possibility that there's something even beyond the pleasure, the well-being, that comes from getting the mind into good states of concentration. This encourages you to start questioning some of your other addictions, such as your sense of self. Our sense of self is basically our strategy for happiness. In the course of the practice we learn how to develop new strategies. That means we develop different senses of ourselves as we go through the practice, as we expand our repertoire. A lot of people feel threatened by the Buddha's teachings on not self precisely for this reason. Your sense of self is your strategy for happiness. When you hear the idea of not self, it sounds as if the Buddha is asking you to abandon everything you know about how to find happiness. No self would leave you with no means for happiness at all. That's the fear. But what he's actually doing is teaching you how to refine your strategies for happiness, developing new strategies that are more effective, ultimately coming up with a strategy that's actually a not-self strategy. It's not that radically different from what he's been teaching you on the more elementary levels, because on those levels he's been teaching you to abandon your unskillful strategies, the addictions that are obviously harmful. But there comes a point in the practice where you have to learn to abandon some of the strategies that were skillful in the beginning, but now are beginning to get in the way of something even more refined. Sometimes you hear people treating your sense of self as an obvious fallacy that causes nothing but harm and stress. If that were the case, it wouldn't take much to let go of it, seeing how obviously harmful it is. But hey, it's part of your strategy for happiness. It has its gratifications. You've got to admit its good side. Still, there comes a point where you have to look at its drawbacks, its limitations. Even your most skillful strategies for happiness at some point have to get dropped. So the Buddha gives you the positive teachings on nibbana to encourage you to let go of those things, even those skillful strategies, when the time comes. At the same time, he refuses to say whether there's going to be a you in there or no you in there. He wants you to develop the attitude that, at this stage, your sense of self is irrelevant to whether you're going to be happy. But he's not saying that you don't exist. When asked point blank if there was a self or there was no self, he refused to answer, saying that if you hold to the idea that there is a self, you get stuck in eternalism, which blocks the practice. You hold on to certain things as being the eternal you, and you'll never be able to let them go. If you develop the idea that there is no self, that's annihilationism, which blocks the practice as well. Either you fear being annihilated or you have a neurotic desire to want to be annihilated, neither of which is helpful. So there comes a point where you have to put issues of self and not self aside, and just look at where there's stress, and what activities are causing the stress, and how to stop them. That's why the teachings on the Four Noble Truths trump every other teaching. It's how the teachings on developing a skillful self or strategies, and the teachings on not self or strategies as well. The teachings on nibbana or strategies, too. Nibbana won't get you to nibbana, but the desire to get there will. So learn to use these strategies to overcome your most blatant and harmful addictions, and then your more subtle ones, until you finally reach what the Buddha called the ultimate happiness, Nibbanam Paramam Sukham, where you can put all your addictions, all your strategies, aside. Antidotes for clinging. October 7, 2007. There are some places in the Pali Canon where the Buddha says that the 5 aggregates are stressful, and others where he says the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. It's important to notice here that he's talking about 2 different kinds of stress. The sense in which the 5 aggregates are stressful is related to stress in terms of the 3 characteristics. They're inconstant and so they're stressful. That's simply the way they are, whether you hold on to them or not. But if you don't grab onto these things, your mind doesn't suffer. It's when you grab on, it's when you cling, that stress comes into the mind. You create a clinging aggregate. You create a connection. This is stress in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Wherever there's craving, there can be clinging, and the clinging to the aggregates is the stress that really weighs on the mind. When we practice, our main focus is on the stress in the Four Noble Truths, the stress that weighs on the mind. If you don't cling to the things that are stressful, then they can be as stressful as they want, but the stress doesn't come in and weigh you down. It's like picking up a heavy object. If you just leave it there on the ground, it doesn't weigh you down. It weighs the same whether you're picking it up or not. When you pick it up, it's 50 pounds. When you leave it on the ground, it's 50 pounds. The difference is that the 50 pounds is suddenly on top of you when you pick it up, and that's when you suffer. That's precisely the stress the Buddha is focusing on. That's the important one to notice. Always try to be clear about this distinction. The real problem isn't the aggregates, it's the clinging. And the word clinging has a double meaning. It can also mean the act of feeding on something. Where we cling is where we look to feed for happiness. We look to the 5 aggregates for food. We munch them down, and then they munch us down. We feed on the form of the body, we feed on feelings, perceptions, thought constructs, and sensory consciousness. When these things are pleasant, they're not too heavy. But they can turn around and turn unpleasant very quickly. They gobble us up, for we've opened a way for them to get to us. Once you start clinging to the good ones, you start clinging to the bad ones as well, because that's where you're looking for food. So it's important to understand clinging so that you can put an end to it. As the Buddha said, there are 4 kinds. There's sensual clinging, clinging to views, clinging to habits and practices, and then clinging to doctrines of the self. All of these hover around the 5 aggregates. They're different ways of clinging to the 5 aggregates. And the Buddha has a different cure for each. Sometimes you hear that the deepest, most underlying form of clinging is the sense of self-identity that you build around things. If you learn how not to have any sense of self-identity, there you are. You've taken care of all the other forms of clinging. Sometimes you hear that clinging to views is the basic form of clinging. If you can deconstruct all your views, you'll be done with all the other forms of clinging as well. So you reason your way to seeing how you can't say that things exist, you can't say that things don't exist, or both, or neither. They're empty. That means that your sensual desire is empty, your habits and practices are empty, your doctrines of the self are empty. With everything empty like that, there's nothing to cling to. But that doesn't work either. After letting things go in this way, you'll find that your sensual desires weren't touched. You just turn around and pick them back up. So you have to realize that each kind of clinging has its own antidote. For example, clinging to sensuality. When the Buddha talks about sensuality, he doesn't say that you're attached to sights or sounds. The word kama, or sensuality, here doesn't mean beautiful or desirable sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations. It means the plans and intentions you have around these things. That's what we're really focused on. We're all attached to the ideas we have of the things we want, wanting them to be a certain way to give us pleasure. In other words, we're more attached to our dreams and plans about sensual pleasures than we are to the sensual pleasures themselves. This is simple enough to see. If you find your sensual desire thwarted in one area, you turn around and you focus it on something else. The desire is what we cling to. We cling to the plans that we make for sensual pleasure. And what are these plans like? For the most part, they're pretty one-sided and sketchy. Say you have designs on somebody else's body. When you think about that person's body, there are only certain details that you think about. A lot of details you don't want to think about at all. Or when you think about a particular relationship, you think about only certain aspects of the relationship and not about others. So the antidote here is to broaden your view, to see that your pursuit of pleasure in this way carries a lot of pain along with it. When the Buddha talks about the drawbacks of sensuality, he starts with the fact that in order to lead a sensual lifestyle, you've got to work. The work in and of itself is painful and wearisome. You work and work and work to build up wealth. Sometimes you gain it, sometimes you don't. Even when you do gain it, there's the fear that, as he says, thieves and kings will steal it. I like the way the Buddha always mentions kings and thieves in the same breath. Water might wash it away, fire might burn it, hateful airs could take off with it. That can easily happen to your wealth. And as the Buddha points out, it's over sensuality that people fight. Parents fight with their children, children fight with their parents, brothers with sisters, sisters with brothers, husband with wife, wife with husband. And not just in the family. There are wars over sensual pleasures as well, because we need to take wealth to pay for our passions, which are far greater than all the wealth in the world. That's how we end up going to war. The Buddha goes down a long list of all the pains and sufferings tied up with this pursuit of our dreams of sensuality. So as you look at the pursuit of sensuality in its entirety, you realize how much pain and suffering it involves. You don't have to look too far. This contemplation we have of the requisites every day, thinking about food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. Just the fact that we have a body makes us a burden on other people. So think about that. Every time your mind starts spinning a web of sensual desire, tell yourself, if you're going to spin a web, spin the full web. Try to encompass the whole picture. Like that daydream that Ajahn Lee reports in his autobiography, from the time he was planning to disrobe. At first it starts out really nice, he even gets a nobleman's daughter for his wife. But then the reality principle starts kicking in. Eventually, because she's a nobleman's daughter, she's not up to the hard work that's required in marrying a peasant son. She dies and leaves him with a child to raise. He gets a second wife. The second wife has a kid of her own and starts playing favorites, abusing the first kid. And so on down the line. When we bring in reality like this, it helps cut through a lot of our delusions around sensuality, a lot of our attachment to sensual designs, sensual plans, sensual dreams. Or you can contemplate the body, in all its parts. You can think of a beautiful body, but when you think of the parts inside, you say woo-eh. Just a few micrometers below the skin there's all this other stuff, and it's inextricably connected with the things you like. Suppose you lust for somebody. You don't like the idea of their intestines, but if you took their intestines out, would you like that person without any intestines? It's not worth taking either way, with or without a liver, with or without a stomach. So when you think in these ways, you begin to realize that your sensual plans and desires are really unrealistic, really misleading. They make you half blind so that they can take you down a path to suffering. Realizing this helps cut through the sensuality. You see how arbitrary all these dreams are, that you can't rely on them. That's what helps you let them go. As for clinging to views, the Buddha has you follow a similar process, but with different details. The process is that he has you look at the drawbacks that come from clinging to a view, one of the major drawbacks being that you inevitably get into arguments with other people. But more than that, the Buddha has you look carefully at the things you have views about. This is where the details differ, and the analysis goes into more technical terms. Your views come down to the question of what exists and what doesn't exist, he says, but when you actually look at your sensory experience, you just see things arising and passing away. As you focus on the arising, the idea of non-existence doesn't occur to you. As you focus on the passing away, the idea of existence doesn't occur to you. You realize that the basic building blocks of experience, when you look at them just on the level of arising and passing away, don't provide a foundation for the very basic polarities of existing and not existing. On top of that, any views you build are sketches based on not looking at things very carefully. So the Buddha has you look very carefully at the process of what it's like to experience things. When you see that views really can't express the truth about things, and that holding on to them is going to cause you to suffer, you can cut through your attachment to them. As for habits and practices, he first has you look at the actual habits or precepts and practices you're attached to. The attachment here is to the idea that if you follow certain rules and you're a good little boy, a good little girl, that's all you have to do. God will be happy with you, or the universe will approve of you, or whatever. So the Buddha has people look directly at their habits and practices together with their results, some of which are actively harmful. Back in his days, sacrifices were believed to be a way to find true happiness. So he talked about looking at the misery that comes through the sacrifices, not only for the animal sacrificed, but also for the people forced to labor in getting the animals killed. Self-torture as a form of austerity was also a popular practice in some circles. So he had you look at the pain that comes from it, to see that it doesn't really lead anywhere. It doesn't really help cleanse the mind. So in this way he'd get people to abandon harmful habits and practices, and replace them with good habits and good practices. The habits we adopt as part of our virtue, the practices we follow in the practice of meditation. But eventually he says to watch out. If you're not careful, you're going to create a sense of conceit around these things, the pride that comes sometimes when I follow the precepts, and you don't, or my jhana is better than yours. The way to get beyond that attachment is not to break the precepts or drop your practice of jhana. It's simply to continue with those practices while learning how not to develop a sense of conceit around them. Realize that you're doing these things not to make yourself better than other people, but simply because they work in cleansing the mind. Finally, there's clinging to doctrines of self. This doesn't mean just the view that I have a self, whatever your sense of self might be. It also means clinging to the view that I have no self. Thinking in either way, the Buddha said, leads you into a thicket of views that will get you entangled. So, as with the cure for clinging to views, the Buddha has you take the polarity of existence or non-existence and put it aside. When the issue of existing or not existing is a non-issue, the idea of a self existing or not existing is a non-issue as well. Instead, the Buddha has you look at things simply in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Where is stress arising? What is the cause of that stress? What's the path to the end of that stress? As you divide up your experience in those terms, the whole issue of who you are or who you're not just gets put aside. You're more focused on what you're doing that's causing stress, learning how to comprehend the stress, learning how to abandon the cause through developing the path, so that ultimately you can realize the end of stress, the end of suffering. That's the way out of that type of clinging. So when you find the mind clinging, weighing itself down with its attachment to the aggregates, try to be clear about exactly which kind of clinging you're suffering from, and what the antidote is, what the medicine that the Buddha prescribed, because it's different in each case. There's no one blanket cure to cover every form of clinging. You've got to develop your discernment from many angles, develop discernment with many facets. Essentially, every approach involves seeing things in terms of being inconstant, stressful, and not self, but those principles get applied in different ways for each type of clinging. So try to keep this list of medicines in mind and apply them as appropriate. That way you put yourself in a position where you're living in a world that's stressful, but you're not pulling the stress inside. You can live surrounded by inconstancy, stress, and not self, but not suffer from it. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.